Here we will take a look at biomes. A biome is a biogeographical region that has certain characteristics in both the biotic and abiotic components. So for our abiotic components, we're looking at an area that has a similar climate, nutrients in the soil or water, light levels, and other abiotic factors. And when we look at the biotic components, we typically have dominant types of species. So we might talk about a grassland, and clearly we have dominantly grasses there. So we can recognize some major areas across Earth and classify them into these distinct biomes. First, we will take a look at terrestrial biomes. We can define 8 different terrestrial biomes based on a combination of precipitation and temperature. Here we see a map that shows the location of some of those biomes. These 2 figures help us visualize the characteristic precipitation and temperature for these different biomes. We see on the left the x-axis has annual temperature and the y-axis has annual precipitation. So if we look at up here in the dark green, those are tropical rainforests. They get a lot of precipitation and they also have high annual temperatures. If we go below that, we see an area where the annual temperature is about the same as the tropical rainforest, but in the savanna and seasonal forest, we get a lot less precipitation. One of the things to notice on this diagram is not only do we see the average amounts, but it shows us the variation as well. For instance, we can see a wide range of precipitation in tropical forests. We can see a very wide range of temperature down here in temperate grasslands and cold deserts. So it shows us not only what the average looks like, but also how much it varies. A somewhat more simplistic image is over here on the right, where we see it going from hot to cold along this axis, and then from wet to dry along that axis. And then we can see where these various regions are. So tundra is up here, and then the coniferous boreal forest. And so what we'll do is look at each one of these. This just shows us those 8 major terrestrial biomes together, and now we'll look at each one. First, we'll look at the tundra. If we look on the map, the tundra is up here at the very top in red. On this graph, we see it over here. Very low temperatures and also very low rainfall. Because of this, we typically see very low-growing shrubs as the dominant plant in a tundra. And of course, for a lot of the year, there will be very little emergent vegetation above the snow and ice layer. Next, we have the boreal forests. We look at where the boreal forests are here. They're right below the tundras. This yellowish area right here is boreal forest. We can see the boreal forest next to the tundra here. So a little bit warmer and a little bit more precipitation. Here we're going to see a lot of dominance in the conifers. So these are evergreen trees, and then also some low-lying plants that we see through here. Conifers are trees that do not shed their leaves. Next, we'll look at temperate forest. Temperate forest is primarily here and then over in this region right here along the east coast of the United States. These temperate forests are typically dominated by deciduous trees, so unlike the conifers, these trees typically lose their leaves in the winter, and we can see that temperate forest right here. A little bit cooler than the tropical forest and not as much rainfall, but clearly warmer and more rain than we had in the boreal forest. Tropical wet forest we see here as the tropical rainforest in green across here, dark green here. Lots of rainfall, very warm. It's near the equator where we have very high species diversity, the most diverse of the terrestrial biomes. Next, we have the chaparral. Chaparral here is in this teal color, and we see it mostly along these coastal regions. So we see some up here and there. In North America, we see it primarily here in California. Chaparral is going to be dominated by shrubs, so not a lot of tall growing trees, but mostly short stature shrub-like vegetation. Next, we have temperate grasslands. The temperate grasslands represent the prairies in the United States. So you can see these temperate grasslands in this area here. The temperate grassland over here is down in this area. Not a lot of rainfall and a pretty big variation in temperature. This is dominated by grasses. The savanna is this light beige color here, and then across here and down here. Savannas are dominated by grasses and small woodlands. We look at savanna in this area, we see there's quite a large range of precipitation and then fairly warm. Next we have the desert. Desert is in gray on this map up here, out in the southwest. We see desert over here where we have high annual temperatures, very low annual precipitation. So most of the plants that we're going to see living in desert conditions are going to have a lot of adaptations to conserve water, like we see cacti here. And a lot of the animals as well will have those adaptations for getting rid of heat and conserving water. You can imagine those two things can be very challenging for an organism like a mammal, where one of the means of cooling down is to sweat, but then there's a lot of water loss. They typically have other adaptations, such as very large ears. One of the things that large ears does is there's a lot of blood flow to that area, and it helps to dissipate that. So that gets us through the 8 major terrestrial biomes. Some references will use a different categorization. They might have more biomes, they might list fewer biomes. Now let's take a look at aquatic biomes. Aquatic biomes are characterized by the amount of light that penetrates into the water. It's also characterized by the temperature of the water and the flow regime. So is this a fast-flowing river or is it more of a stagnant area? It also can characterize them based on the amount of dissolved solids in the water. Some of the major aquatic biomes, we have the marine biomes, which are represented by ocean, coral reefs, and estuaries. And then we have freshwater biomes, lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and wetlands. Let's take a look at the ocean biome. When we look at the ocean, we separate it into different zones based on water depth, distance from the shoreline, and then also the amount of light getting through. When we look at water depth, we can look at the very bottom here, the benthic realm, and then everything else above that is the pelagic realm. If we look at it from distance from the shore, we can separate it moving this way. We have the intertidal zone, so this is area that gets covered during tides and then also exposed. And then we have the neritic zone, where we're still sort of at that shelf. And then when that shelf really drops off, we're in the oceanic zone. Then, if we want to look at the way that light penetrates, we've got these 3 zones here. We've got the photic zone where light gets through, the aphotic zone that does not get a lot of light penetration, and then the abyssal zone, and then the abyssal zone below that. This shows us a picture of organisms from this intertidal zone. Here we see a coral reef. Coral reefs are formed by the calcium carbonate skeletons from the coral. And remember, coral are marine invertebrates that belong to the phylum Cnidaria. We see coral from around 30 degrees north and south of the equator. And remember, that's also an area where we tend to find very high diversity. So just like we see high diversity in the terrestrial ecosystems around the equator, we also see high diversity in these coral reefs. The issue today is the decline of coral. As the ocean temperature warms, it can cause die-off of some of these corals, and this could be further exacerbated by runoff into the ocean. These coral reefs are foundation and keystone species in that entire ecosystem. If we lose coral, that can have a huge effect on many of the other organisms that live in that area. An estuary is where fresh and salt water meet. Because of this, the salinity in an estuary can vary quite a bit. It depends a lot on rainfall because it's going to be very shallow in an estuary, depends on tidal flow. So there's a lot of different things that causes that salinity to really go up and down a lot. And that means that it's very physiologically challenging for the organisms that live there. So some organisms can do well in that environment, but many organisms cannot. Estuaries are important habitats for developing fish, mollusks, and crustaceans. Next, we have lakes and ponds. Typically, these are going to be deep enough so they'll have both photic and aphotic zones. You'll have an area across the top that gets light and it's photic, and then you'll have a deeper layer that is aphotic that it doesn't get light. And because of that, we also will see thermal stratification. In that upper layer that's getting a lot of sunlight, that'll heat up. If you go down in the water, it'll get cooler as you get below this photic zone. What also ends up happening is during different times of the year, that thermal stratification will switch. When it gets cold, the water at the bottom will be warmer and the water at the top will be colder. So we get this turnover of that stratification. And with that turnover, we often will get turnover of the nutrients as well. In lakes and ponds, the amount of available nitrogen and phosphorus are very important limiting nutrients. This picture shows us an algae bloom. So we've had probably runoff into this area, too many nutrients going into that, causing this algae bloom. Rivers and streams are continuously moving bodies of water, unlike lakes and ponds. And they will carry water from a source, which we call the headwater, to the mouth of a lake or the ocean. Rivers can range from being very narrow and shallow or very wide and slow moving. Next we have wetlands. Wetlands are areas where the soil is either permanently or periodically saturated with water. So it may not have standing water all the time, but at some point of the year it does get saturated with water. And the legal definition of a wetland keeps changing because of how long that period of saturation has to be. You have emergent vegetation, unlike many lakes and ponds where you do have plants but they're down below the surface. In wetlands they are emergent, they are coming up out of the water. Some examples of wetlands include marshes, swamps, bogs, salt marshes, mudflats. And some of the differences, marshes and swamps tend to have slow, steady water flow. So think of the Everglades in Florida. And then bogs are areas where there's a clay bottom, so the water doesn't percolate down, and so it just kind of sits there and becomes stagnant. And because of that, it's very low in oxygen, it's very low in pH. That just gives us a brief look at some of the biomes of the world.